All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining us, and especially our esteemed guests. Joe, Zach, Charlie. This is going to be a fun conversation. I'm Karan Wadhera from Casa Verde Capital, and the idea here is just to have a fun and fluid conversation about the challenges and some of the exciting journey of building a product and a tool that so many of us interact with, and in the case of Square, something that's really changed commerce in a big way. In the case of Greenbits, something that's been central to the cannabis economy. So I'm really excited about this conversation. Before we get into it, maybe we can just go around quickly, introduce ourselves, tell us a little bit about what you did in the past, what you're working on now, and then we'll kick it off. Joe, why don't we start with you?
Sure. Thanks for having us. I'm Joe Robinson. Yeah, I was at Square from 2011 to 2014. I was an early product manager there and worked on a couple of different projects. I think first was Square Dashboard, which is the kind of merchant-facing interface for managing inventory, transactions, accounting, different aspects of the product. Super interesting learning experience, and got to work with a lot of great small businesses. I went into cryptocurrency after that, which is just taking off this week, which is great given some of the PayPal news around it. I was with a company called Circle. And most recently, I've been working on my own startup, which is Hummingbird, focused on financial compliance. And actually, I'm a lot closer to the cannabis space now than I ever have been, given I'm helping some of the banks and credit unions that are working with cannabis companies with their banking. So
amazing.
Thanks for having me. It's been an interesting journey.
Very cool. Zach?
I'm Zach. So I am an engineer by background and by training. So I was also at Square from middle of 2010 to 2015. And actually worked with Joe on some of the stuff that he talked about. So Merchant Dashboard was a team that I helped out with. Ended up leading a lot of the engineering teams across product and growth and international expansion and some of the hardware development. And then I started a company beginning of 2016 called Common Networks, and still there, one of the co-founders, head of engineering. And we are building a new way to deliver broadband internet to people. So looking at residential broadband, how can you deliver a fiber quality experience without having to tear the streets up and install fiber?
Very cool. Thank you, Zach. Charlie.
Yeah, hi, I'm Charlie. I'm in the cannabis industry. I've been with Greenbits for about 4 years. Prior to that, most of my career has been in payments and commerce. So with publicly traded companies from Visa to microcaps like Green Dot to venture-backed businesses. Kind of immediately prior to Greenbits, as kind of payments and small business software, that convergence was occurring like you guys experienced at Square. Kind of saw that. Some of my prior businesses actually were Square distributed software to small businesses through Square and Clover and Shopify. So kind of saw that trend, kind of applied it, saw the opportunity in cannabis, and joined Greenbits about 4 years ago, and have been here ever since.
Charlie, maybe the quick 15, 20 seconds on what Greenbits is.
Yep. So Greenbits is kind of at the intersection of software and payments for the retailers within cannabis. We serve more than 1,000 dispensaries. We handle about $4 billion in sales annually, and deal with a lot of the nuances of the regulatory and compliance framework state by state.
Awesome. Okay, so the commonality obviously between Square and Greenbits is, in many ways when people ask me as a, one of the Greenbits investors, sort of what Greenbits is, I say really quickly the Square for cannabis. And so in certain ways where you guys are both point of sale, I'd say there's obviously lots of key nuances and differences in the businesses, but one of the main ones that I see that's really interesting, obviously, is that, when Square was built, you really were disrupting and replacing, a more traditional way that a lot of retailers were operating. And then obviously it's since gone beyond that. For Greenbits, while that may be the case in certain instances, for many folks, Greenbits was the first point of sale, for a cannabis retailer, and so you were kind of building oftentimes your retail operation around it. So I guess I would start with let's start with you, Zach. As Square was being built, what became the biggest challenge, and how were you able to start to convert customers towards sort of thinking in a little bit differently, and what was the value proposition early on to get retailers and other shops using the product?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think there's actually a lot of commonalities, I think, between what Greenbits is doing and what Square is doing. Like Square's entry point into most businesses was day one. Like there was some people that weren't able to access credit card payments. Square opened that up and made it possible for them to sort of get on the credit card rails. But especially after the first few years, a lot of the growth was basically finding new businesses that were just installing their first point of sale system or just getting started, and being the sort of default option for them. They'd heard about it from their small business owner friends. They'd seen it in shops. They knew that this was like a great product and a great option. And I think that's a great entry point, because like it aligns kind of the trajectory of the company with the trajectory of your customers. So you are successful because you make your customers more successful. And also you're serving people that are maybe starting their first pop-up, and then you're rapidly trying to build the product so that by the time they make it to be a multinational retail chain, you've got something that can actually serve them 5-10 years down the line as well. So that story from Greenbits really resonates. That's really a familiar set of problems that we're solving at Square as well.
And then as you were able to start converting, because I'm assuming the market of just new businesses very large, but I'm assuming at some point Greenbits is involved with this as well, as you go into new markets, taking people off or replacing your current infrastructure. What ended up becoming the most sort of challenging part of that, or how were you able to start doing that? And either of you, Joe, is that going to tackle that? Yeah.
Yeah, I give my perspective. I'd be curious to hear Joe's as well. I think we saw kind of different sides of this problem. I think from when I think about like what Square sort of had to do and like unlocked in order to get to sort of rapid growth, I think the one part is about like what is the product experience you're offering to customers? How do you build something that's 10 times better than what they had before? And I think on those dimensions, a lot of it was around ease of sign up and speed of getting up and running, and then like product experience, and to a lesser extent price. Like Square was always competitive on price, but I don't think we're ever sort of industry leading until maybe more recently with scale. I think they've gotten to a point where they actually really are pretty competitive in the pricing space. But for a lot of people, it was, the choice in front of them was, I'm starting my business. I can go with this thing that takes me 5 minutes to set up. I get a free reader. I'm ready to accept credit cards, like maybe the same day if I went and bought that reader at a Walgreens or a Target, versus going through a 4 to 6 week background check process where there's like a 30% failure rate, and then you may or may not get a point of sale system at the end. And you're probably going to get nailed with a bunch of extra fees that are going to be a surprise. And that, like those two experiences and that sort of onboarding, I think were really critical to differentiating like what Square meant for people. The ability to really sign up and say, yes, like swipe your credit card, take $1 from yourself. Like that was kind of the magic moment for a lot of people, especially starting a business. There's a lot of things to handle. You got to like deal with all this other stuff. You don't want to also read the fine print in your credit card processing agreement.
I think that actually gets overlooked a lot in the history of Square, because from an external perspective, you look at it and it's like, what's the great innovation? Well, obviously it's like plugging this thing into your phone and taking credit cards. The other innovation was just that, like to get a merchant processing account went from, I don't know, like whatever you said, Zach, like 4 weeks plus, and brutal amounts of paperwork and deep probing by your bank and things like that, to like, sign up in an app in 2 minutes and you're processing credit cards, right? So like that, it was like a process innovation in addition to the actual hardware play.
Yeah, I think the insight there was really around risk. It was the, credit card processing historically mixed two kinds of risks together. There was the financial risk and there was the compliance risk. And they were both solved with a credit report and like extensive background check by your bank, which is just like a miserable experience for everybody involved. And Square separated those out, right? Like it was, the compliance risk was handled by a much lighter weight process that, did enough checking to ensure that somebody could get sort of access to financial rails. And then all the fraud risk and financial risk stuff was handled totally separately. And it ramped up basically in the amount of diligence we put people through based on how much they processed. So if you sign up, you process $1, like who cares? Company can't lose that much money. Like it's not that, you don't have to put a really heavyweight process on that. But as people start processing, as you see velocity and total like GMV increase, like you want to actually put these people through the paces and make sure they're not, selling illegal or unsupported in some cases products.
And this is a much weightier concern in the cannabis industry. I'm sure, Charlie, you're experiencing this a lot, where whereas others before in the payment processing space and POS space have probably we'll just call it bent the rules a little bit, the the ability to do so in this industry is definitely not advisable. So
I resonate. Like, we've obviously been students of Square, and I would agree with you guys both wholeheartedly. I think the real innovation that Square brought was the simplicity and the transparency of the offering itself, but in addition, the onboarding process. And I think with Greenbits, what we really tried to do, I think, and we've done well in some cases, we've got a lot of work to do in others, is the intuitiveness, the simplicity, particularly at the point of sale and the register, against the backdrop of some of those compliance obligations. I think where our model and our business is a little bit different is Square's entry point was really the payment processing piece, and then you built out the register over time. Whereas in our particular industry, given some of the dynamics you talk about, our entry point is really the point of sale and the related software, and then the payment processing comes over time. I think the other dynamic that we try to draw from but wrestle with is the cannabis universe has the characteristics of the buyer look a lot like a small business retailer, probably very similar from a mindset perspective in some respects to Square's early customer base, but the dollar volume is massive. So they have characteristics of small business, but certain characteristics of arguably mid-size and even enterprise businesses. And I think, to your credit, this makes our lives a little bit difficult, but this is a good thing. I think the expectation that comes out of a software solution today is much higher today because of products like Square. So the richness of capability, the richness of the experiences that Square really innovated on to establish are expected kind of out of the gate. And that makes our job, and candidly our competitors and our peers' jobs, very difficult because those expectations are high. We're all pedaling very quickly to kind of fill in those gaps, but it's an ambitious effort when you've got the combination of the software, the payments, and the hardware aspect to it that comes into play.
It's funny you say that, because I remember actually talking with Joe about this, how it felt like we were doing the same thing to catch up to the existing point of sale systems. And so we had examples of a bunch of existing NCR systems and Toshiba systems and other stuff where we were looking at it, we're like, oh my God, there's so many features we have to build before somebody will adopt our product. And if I remember that feeling of pedaling as fast as you could just to catch up with people's expectations.
It's probably the key difference that I've observed as I've learned about cannabis compliance and some of the players in the space like Greenbits, where we as Zach mentioned, we looked a lot at existing point of sale systems, and I think the other key component of your business, Charlie, is probably the inventory management. And for Square, candidly, that was kind of overlooked in the early phases. It was something we went super deep on from a research perspective of barcodes and item libraries and how do we integrate these things with the experience. But it was always something that was more researchy and really kind of didn't become a core part of the product for a long, long time. I think they just recently acquired a company that we'd looked at, 7-8 years ago.
There were a few swings at it too. I remember multiple large projects trying to improve inventory management, and each of them, it's a really hard problem.
Now you have this regulated space where you're required to do seed to sale tracking, and that requirement does not exist in the normal point of sale world. So it's a fascinating juxtaposition for folks like Greenbits. That's probably the main pain point that you're solving, right?
Yeah, I would agree. And appreciate you saying this. It's validating, the pain and the struggles that we have, but the journey that we're on, and that you're absolutely right. You've got a fragmented regulatory framework, so state by state. You've got a rapidly evolving regulatory framework, and I think those regulatory frameworks are largely immature. The policymakers, the technology providers supporting them, it makes it very, very difficult to kind of, and we struggle with that. And I would say I've never been in a company where the importance of, and this is obviously relevant everywhere, but the importance of prioritization and how you go about tackling those problems is acute, because we have finite resources. That checkerboard that we're trying to fill is massive. And if we're putting our checker pieces in the wrong place, we're wasting a lot of time and resources. And being really crystal clear and precise on that is important. It's challenging, but it's necessary.
Yeah, that checkerboard compliance challenge is really interesting. I think we ran into this probably really for the first time we tried to go international at Square, and like a lot of the back end pieces around, I mean, obviously the credit card rails and the settlement rails and stuff were kind of country specific, but the compliance piece was very different country to country. And I like to joke that like every country has a thing that they're afraid of that they built their whole compliance infrastructure around. And in the US, it's like terrorism and like money to support terrorism. In Japan, it's organized crime. And so everything was about like, make sure nobody's got tattoos, there's no Yakuza coming in, accepting credit cards. Like that was what like the entire backend system was built around. It was very interesting, very different problem. I can only imagine what it's like to do it across dozens of US states and like, conflicting like regulatory frameworks on like the state and federal level.
Yeah, no, we definitely wrestle with it. And I think this speaks back to the prioritization. And I would observe, as an observer, I think Square did this fairly well, like, being pretty disciplined around kind of the evolution and the prioritization of the roadmap. I think this gets to, hey, I think we're better served if we do a few things really well than lots of things, to a mediocre level. And that's challenging. Karan, you can probably appreciate this. Like there's a portfolio of technology companies out there. And I think it's important that you're kind of the master of your domain before you try to take on, other domains. And it's easy to get wrapped up in that or take missteps there. But I think it's really critical to the success because of that fragmentation, because of that complexity of the inventory and the regulatory frameworks. So again, it's a constant dance that we're trying to do.
It's nice to hear that we came across as disciplined. I'm sure Joe remembers. It did not feel disciplined from the inside. It felt like we were scattered in 1,000 different directions and trying to figure out like what to put our chips behind and what to focus on.
Charlie brings up a good point. One of the funny things that we have here in cannabis, and I'm curious to understand if there's an analog to what you guys are dealing with, right? Is many players are vertically integrated, right? So it means that in many states and in many areas, the same folks who are cultivating, manufacturing, distributing are also retailing. So for those folks, and this is kind of like what we've seen in many businesses, right? Like they would love to see the all-in-one solution, right? You're like, oh, this is cool, but what about all the way back down to my, my greenhouse and here? Like, is it the same piece of software? And in many ways, like, and Charlie can attest to that. That struggle in conversation to say like, no, I mean, we integrate with other players who do other parts of it, but we're really focused on making sure the retail experience is perfect. At what point for Square was there the conversation around, really having solid integrations, and how important was that? And at which phase did that become more relevant?
I think really late, actually, really late, like years down the road. In fact, I think there was kind of a strategy of like trying to kind of occupy as much of the experience as possible for as long as possible. And I think one of the first areas that I remember it just created like brutal pain is in accounting. Because like, every small business has to do accounting, and like, to be honest, it felt like, we were just slow. I don't want to like throw anyone under the bus, and I should probably take responsibility for it as the PM of Dashboard, but like it was hard to make movement in that critical business operations area.
I think we also just underappreciated the complexity there, right? Like you're getting into like, we would get these like very detailed like complaints from people's CPAs being like, hey, you rounded incorrectly in this like subcategory, and so therefore like everything's off by 1 cent at the end. And we're like, okay, I got to go find an accountant. I don't understand what you just said.
Yeah. It makes sense. I mean, I think a core design philosophy at Square was to reduce as much complexity as possible into very simple experiences. And, I think that's a great grounding philosophy. I think entrepreneurs should always think about that, and designers and things like that. I kind of question in a space like this, and then, multivariate, equation like cannabis retail, where you have tracking needs across the supply chain and regulatory, burdens and licensing and things like that. The extent to which you can do that, it's obviously a great goal to strive for, but I don't think you can obscure as much as we are trying to, just simply remove parts of the process for payment processing.
Yeah, I think one thing that I think Square eventually got right, but it took a long time to get there, was opening up external APIs to help fill some of those gaps. And being a little bit more of a platform and saying like, look, we don't have the bandwidth or in-depth knowledge or resources to like deeply understand every single problem for every kind of small business, retail or otherwise. And let's start partnering with folks who really get that stuff and can like help us to solve it. And there's a real win-win relationship there when somebody else can sell their product through Square and get a tight data integration, and it's better for the small business owner at the end of the day.
I'd love kind of your thoughts. If recollection serves me, the API was there, so the ability to build some of that stuff I think existed, but the accessibility beyond the merchant to third parties was kind of held back for a period of time. Curious, do you think you got that timing right? Like, was it wise to not make that available and recognize that you might have some limitations? Because we struggle with it, because maintaining a platform and maintaining that API and the support for that API is a big body of work in and of itself. And kind of curious how you guys thought about the way that Square went about that, whether they got it right, a little too early, a little too late.
I bet Joe and I had the same perspective on this, but
go ahead.
Hear yours.
Well, no, I mean, I think it's funny. I think Zach's current colleague, Mark, maybe led the initial API efforts. Is that right? Yeah. So that was, call it 4 or 5 years after the founding of Square. And it was like pretty well along at that point.
Yeah. I think it was way too late. I think like
it was pretty late, and certain other payment companies that are fairly API driven were coming into market at that point. So yeah, it was interesting.
Yeah, I think it was something that I think we just didn't think about it the way we thought about other products. Like Square, at least when I was there, was very design driven, and I think that focused us on a lot of things that were more sort of interactive and visual. And I think it took a long time to get folks into the right positions where they started to think about the API as a product. And like, what is the, really from like, what is the job being done? What are the pain points for customers? What is the right way to solve this? And looking at it in a data-driven way, like what APIs are being accessed? What kind of data are people like looking for? Are we providing the right solutions here? And I think it just took a long time to kind of, for that mindset to get adopted around the platform and not just like, the app and the product and sort of the things that were more tangible.
Yep. What about identity? You guys have talked about kind of the payment processing piece. Kind of through Square's evolution, did Square identify as a payments company, as a software company, and how did that evolve or change over time? Because that identity will be a driver of where you place those chips, oftentimes.
That's a great question. I definitely think it was kind of a product or payments company versus, thinking of anything as software. Really, it was much more about the experience of the payment and the form factor for merchants and things like that. Whole whole markets that didn't have credit card processing, like farmers markets and things like that, were kind of enabled by the product. And I think the marketing and design teams really kind of leaned into that concept of these experiences with smaller merchants and local business and, kind of a enablement, lifestyle enablement service, basically.
I think there was an evolution there. Also, I think for the first couple of years, I don't think this sort of identity as a small business provider was really fixed. I think a lot of stuff was sort of taken from the perspective of the consumer, and it took a while for the company to kind of wrap its head around the fact that small business is interesting, right? Because it's got aspects of enterprise and aspects of consumer, and the focus was really on the sort of consumer side and consumer experience for a while. And I think to some extent, as part of why I think we're a little blind to some of these things that are really about sort of the enterprise side of running a small business. Accounting and reporting and integrations with your QuickBooks and whatever else. So it just wasn't kind of top of mind for a lot of folks who really focused on that product experience of payments and what does the receipt look like, and what kind of loyalty programs can we build, and what's the sign up experience like, and stuff like
that. I have a question for you guys. As the company grew and you started getting a lot of customer and merchant feedback, right, on the laundry list of things they wanted improved or changed, how did that work internally in terms of, kind of Charlie referred to the prioritization of the roadmap, and how did even that process evolve?
It's a good question.
Yeah, I as a product manager, I think one of the things that Square did pretty well was creating pretty autonomous, smaller teams within the company. So, there was certainly knowledge sharing and visibility into roadmaps and ideas, but relatively small teams were pretty empowered to build the things that were right for their side of the business. And so, you saw splits there's this sort of mobile phone product. There was eventually the tablet product, Register. There was the back of office stuff, Dashboard. There were, of course, many follow-on services around SaaS businesses and Square Capital, and now Cash, of course, is almost like a standalone company. Speaking from the perspective of the teams I worked on, it was always very customer informed, and definitely did a lot of work to try and bubble up the stuff that was the most critical and most important for what was a very large user base, millions of merchants. So
yeah, it was pretty independent. The teams, I don't think there was ever really a unified company level roadmap. There were different roadmaps for kind of different types of customers, the buyer side, the seller side, the platform side, but there was never sort of a unified company. We tried a couple times to do a company level stack rank of all the things we should be working on. And I think Square operated in a little bit more of a decentralized manner, where there was the buyer team and they had their own prioritization framework and their own priorities, and then teams had to coordinate amongst each other to make sure that things that launched had some cohesiveness to them and weren't totally crazy.
Did that evolve over time? I think the organizing principles sound fairly similar today, with kind of the seller group and the and whatnot. Because obviously, as you scale, the challenges they evolve or they look different. How did that approach change over time as we think about scaling our own business? What lessons did you learn?
Yeah, I think the Square grew at a pretty ridiculous clip. I think it was basically doubling every 9 months, and so I've described this experience to people as it's like driving a 18-wheeler down a hill and your brakes don't work. And so you're all right, the hill has to end at some point. So let's just keep this thing on the road for as long as possible and try not to crash it. But it always felt you're a little bit behind everything and a little bit out of control constantly. And so the organization was constantly evolving to try and keep up with that growth rate. And so, I think one thing that I think actually worked out pretty well is Square embraced, I think, kind of refactoring the organization on a regular basis. So it meant like we did a lot of reorgs, but it meant that like teams were better aligned around what was going on, as opposed to kind of sticking with something because it was the way that we'd done it last year, or this person had previously led that thing and they should keep leading it. And so to some extent, I think like the leadership treated the organizational structure similar to the way we treated products, which was like, what is the right solution here? What should we fix? Like, what is the optimal thing? And then try and, match that up against reality and, not thrash people too hard, but not be afraid to kind of make pretty big organizational changes along the way.
Can I ask a question? And this is also something that I think, not just Greenbits, but a lot of our companies will eventually deal with. But, both of you, Joe and Zach, were, quite early at Square and, saw some pretty incredible things happen. And then both of you, as well as many others probably, from, your vintage or class have moved on to do other things. What ends up being those sort of tipping point moments? And let's take, money investing off the table, but that gets you guys saying, all right, I want to move on. I want to do something. As we sit here today, I mean, Square is an almost $80 billion company now. It is, it is a behemoth in certain ways. What starts to change, outside of, wanting new challenges, which I totally understand, that makes you say like, okay, this is time for me to sort of move on. And then the flip side to that question, and it may be harder to ask or answer because you're not there anymore, is how does the organization then still continue to flourish when a lot of these key early members who were critical in building this business then leave?
It's a great question. It's probably a hard one to answer in some ways, but I mean, it seems like there are kind of natural tipping points around vesting schedules and liquidity events, and there's all kinds of reasons people will leave a company. I left because I got an offer that I was like super interested in, and I had the opportunity to work with a team that I'd worked with before and really liked, and it's interesting. It goes through phases. And I think Zach and I both experienced one thing which stands out in my mind is like, there are two offices. We went through an office change, like kind of midway through my time there. And probably about the same for you, Zach. And like, it just had very different feel. Like, so literally the physical space changed kind of the feel of the company a bit. There was the first office had this like kind of wall of energy as you walked into it, but it was also like kind of akin to working in a shopping mall or something. It was just like very crowded, probably too many people in one space. And then as the company grew up and had more revenue, more funding, the office got a little bit nicer, a little bit, yeah, a lot more spacious, like, and that felt good too, but it was totally different. It was like night and day when the move actually happened. So. Yeah, I think, I think Square had some good cultural stuff in place around, when people left, it was a celebration. It wasn't, we never like shunned people for leaving or taking another opportunity. It was always like excitement for them and like what they were going to do next, and the hope that we get to work together again in the future. I think that creates like a healthy culture around people moving on when it's the right time for them, as opposed to being afraid to do it or being sort of like pressured into staying beyond what sort of the natural course of their time with the company. I think Square spent a lot of time focusing on hiring and recruiting. So as like in the 5 years I was there, I probably did over 1,000 interviews, and like finding great people, hiring great people, putting them, getting them like responsibility fast and like ramping them up as quickly as possible was a big focus for the company. I think really created a lot of bench strengths. Like as people were, had exciting new opportunities or, for whatever reason, were ready to move on, like we had a really good deep bench of folks that could sort of step up into those roles. I think for me personally, like
I was just ready for a break. Like I left in 2015 and basically took the next 9 months off. So I was just, there were Square's amazing company, and I still recommend it to people who are looking for cool stuff to work on. But personally, I was just ready to like not think about anything for a while.
Charlie, I'll flip it to you because, even though it's not the exact same, clearly, even, within Greenbits, there's been growth, there's been change, there's been, new leadership, et cetera. I mean, how has that been, for you personally, and then, for the company and the DNA, and like, what have been the sort of challenges that comes with, being a company with, servicing a handful of retailers and, now sort of, in the hundreds and thousands, like how does that change the sort of internal dynamics?
Yeah, it's a good question. I would say you got to be kind of self-aware enough around what you did well yesterday to get you to today may not be what you need to keep doing today to get you to tomorrow, and so on. So I think having kind of some awareness and cognizance of that is really important. Something we try to get right. Are we kind of organizing and orienting the business in the right way at the right points in time? On the talent question, I think that's a great one. Like, we're always looking for, functional expertise, but I think there's a lot of value in like broad-based generalists who are just incredibly smart. And then in our industry, the cannabis domain experience, there's some relevance, to it as well. And trying to get the right formula of people, particularly for the right role against those various vectors, is something that, we spend a lot of time thinking about. For example, in the sales organization, we've looked at, pure SaaS software salespeople with no cannabis experience. We've pulled salespeople out of, some of our customers, like not our customers per se, but retailers. And we've seen success with both, but it's like, what's the right mix to get the right leverage at the right points in time? And it's a challenge, but I agree. The investment in talent is critical. We put a lot of, energy and focus on that, and it sounds like you guys did as well.
Yeah, I mentioned you guys have a problem, which is like there just isn't a lot of domain expertise, right? Like this wasn't a legal industry until recently. So it's not like people have been doing this for 10, 15, 20 years, at least not, on the resume.
Yeah, very, very true. And I think it's become incredibly normalized, but I go back to my early days. Like there were candidates who were very good candidates who just didn't want to be anything or associated with cannabis. And that still exists today, to a much, much lesser degree. I think there's an overall maturation of the industry. I think there's a draw to it because it is growing rapidly. It is kind of here to stay. I think people are seeing that. So the pool of talent, whether you're one of our customers, if you're a retail operator, the pool of available talent to them is increasing. If you're a technology company like us, the pool of available talent is increasing. You're right though. Like, I personally learned this industry on the fly. Like, I brought a different set of skills and learned cannabis. There aren't a lot of people who, have deep knowledge in cannabis and experience at Square, for example.
Well, I'd like to ask a final question, from the cannabis / Greenbits perspective of the Square folks. Payments is something that is not really there yet in cannabis. I mean, we have it in certain kind of solutions in certain ways, but for the most part, in the fact that Square was really built around payments, cannabis has not been. So it's something that's sort of coming into our ecosystem, or we hope it will come into our ecosystem in the near future. I guess I would ask, what are the kind of lessons you can share as we, once that's going to be sort of available and open to us to start integrating, is there anything that's sort of non-intuitive aside from, connecting to a gateway and like what's been learned from the Square journey that could be helpful as we dive into that, in the next couple of years, hopefully?
That's a great question. One thing I can answer a little bit on is like getting connected into the gateways. One lesson that was interesting for us, especially when we were looking at international stuff, was it can be hard to distinguish when talking to the various partners that you need to kind of get on the financial rails. What is custom, what is like organizational rule, and what is law. And like being able to distinguish those things turns out to be really valuable, because they're like, oh, we don't do that. And you're like, well, is it against the law? Is it just something you've never done before? Is it actually a written regulation that says you can't do this? And finding sort of where, being able to distinguish what those things were, and finding the things that, were not illegal, were not against the bank rules, they just had never tried before and they were a little confused by, was like a pretty interesting entry point for a lot of the products that required integration with like the financial rails.
I think the scarcity of payments in cannabis today is probably largely driven by compliance risk. I think it behooves people in the space to kind of become familiar with what the practice area is looking for, what it's trying to achieve, what your regulators and bank partners are thinking about. Because it'll be hard earned, right, for the industry to actually have the capability of payments and bank accounts, and that's really only going to come through consideration of some of the rules and regulations that are preventing financial institutions from getting deeper into it now. Obviously, pretty positive trend with state by state moving there, and local credit unions and things like that being able to, obviously, like a shift in the federal perspective on it would be, a pretty big game changer, because it's one of the things that's keeping, a lot of banks out of what they know is a very cash rich industry. So, yeah.
One other thing from just from the perspective of an engineer that was interesting about working on payments versus other types of systems is the correctness and availability requirements on payments is really interesting and challenging. Because if you're working on social media, like you lose somebody's tweet, like they're not that mad about it. Like a payment doesn't go through, or it doesn't show up immediately on the dashboard, or what was expected to go into the nightly deposit isn't there for whatever reason. Like people really care a lot about that stuff and are watching like every single cent as it flows through. And the worst experiences at Square were always payments related downtimes, because it was incredibly stressful, and you knew that people were like not able to run their businesses, and you also knew the support team was getting blown up by people immediately noticing and immediately like escalating to like maximum ire, like 0 to 60 in like a few seconds.
Yeah. It's interesting. I would, there's the technical component that Zach mentioned. I mean, maybe something to kind of leave the growth conference audience with is like, why do all these regulations exist? And like, why is it hard to have these things? And, I think to develop empathy with the folks who are creating those and would be providing the payment services, they're concerned that like, somewhere in the supply chain, money is coming into the system that shouldn't be there, right? And so to the extent to which you're able to actually demonstrate that it's not, and everything is above radar, like you'll be in a better spot, for financial services for sure.
Yeah, I would say that's true in the approach that we've taken. We've really, particularly with the banking payments universe, taken an approach. It's less about asking for what we need right now, and it's starting more around let us educate you and let you educate us. And I think if you establish that baseline, you establish the foundation by which then you can build to the requisite needs. So I good to hear that. We definitely wrestle with it, but that's kind of the approach that we've taken. Like, we're not going to try to convince the bank to do something yet. We're going to try to help the bank understand the way the world works first.
All right. Well, it's one of these conversations where I think we could jump into a lot of different sort of segments to uncover, but I think this was really fun, and definitely for me as someone sort of sitting here and hearing a lot of the similarities, right, between the businesses and similar growing pains regardless of the kind of industry and segment you may be tackling. So this was a lot of fun. Thank you, Joe and Zach and Charlie, for taking the time. I think hopefully this is something the growth audience enjoyed. And, we should do this again in a few years and see where things are and make it happen.
Great. Yeah, thank you for organizing this. This is great.
Thank you.